Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our third Techne Bytes episode. Today we have with us Noha Rizk, and she's the Director of Consumer Marketing and Commerce and Payments at Facebook, all the way from San Francisco. Everyone, please welcome Noha. Do we have Noha here?
I'm here.
Noha, how are you?
I'm good. Good morning or good evening. I guess it's morning here.
Yeah, so it's morning. What time is it in San
Sunday
Francisco?
to those who celebrate. Happy Easter to those who are celebrating on the other side of the world.
Thanks, Noha. Thanks for joining us. And we have a lot of questions for you today, and assume everyone else does. But before we start, I know that you've been in Cairo for a long time, and then you moved to San Francisco. You were involved in several organizations, whether it's Citibank, American Express. Before Facebook, you were at PayPal, the global head of GTM marketplaces. So all the way from Cairo to San Francisco, how was this journey? Tell us more about your story, how you started and how you ended up in San Francisco.
First of all, thank you for having me. I'm actually kind of flattered. I never thought there was anything particularly special about my story. I think, the one follow through the story is none of it was planned. Things just happen. And I guess I just went with the flow most of the time. I actually always wanted to be an artist. So surprisingly, I ended up doing something the complete opposite. But my work has primarily, I would say, been about launching things or unblocking really complicated things. So when I started at Citi, the reason why I started and the reason why I was excited to join it, I never thought I would be a banker. And I never thought I would work in the financial services industry. I actually distinctly remember when I was in college saying, goodness, bankers are so boring. I'm never going to do this. And I ended up doing it for years and years. And the reason why I did it and the reason why I found it interesting was because we were literally launching Citi from the ground up in Egypt, retail banking operations. And we were given the opportunity to really be entrepreneurs just with someone else's money, which was kind of great because you got to learn about, how do you navigate a complicated legal environment? How do you set up a team? How do you position yourself in a very cluttered space as a new brand? Like, how do you do branding? How do you segment your market? So we got to learn a lot. So my Citi years were truly formative and enabled me to really learn a lot about setting up a business. And then from there on, it was just, I think most entrepreneurs would agree that it's a bug and you kind of get hooked to it. You just want to do difficult things from there on. You just want to, push through something that no one has done before or solve a really difficult problem. And that's kind of what I looked for, as I moved from banking to the travel industry. to even dabbled with government a little, and then moved back into the financial services industry, was always about, we've got this really big problem, we don't know how to solve it, can you help us? And for me, that's all I needed to hear to move from one job to the next. Yes, absolutely, that's what I want to do. I want to solve a really difficult problem. Moving to the Bay Area was a family thing. My husband works for Microsoft and we had to move for his job. And surprisingly, we didn't go to Seattle. We decided to stick with sunny California. And when I came here, it was hard. We've moved around before. Like I lived in England before. I lived in some other parts of the world. I lived in Dubai. But to be honest, I think this was the hardest move. Culturally, I was used to working, with big American companies, so that wasn't really the problem. I think just being in a place that is so far from everywhere else that I've been, and then just adjusting to, finding your space and finding your people. Everywhere else I've been, I had friends or I had connections or I had people. And being placed somewhere where I knew nobody, and just slowly ramping that up and figuring your way around and understanding this part of the world and understanding its place and why it's unique and what's not unique about it took a while. It took a few years, I have to say. But we kind of have our groove now and we consider it home. So that's kind of where we're at.
Great, great. So there's a big myth about San Francisco, and everyone wants to go to Silicon Valley. When they have their startups here, they want to go there. And Silicon Valley is a very special place, and it has its own boundaries. It has its own story. So what is the big thing about San Francisco? And I'm a big believer that startup communities are city based, and there's always an opportunity and there's always a challenge, a problem to solve in local cities and all cities all over the world. But the Bay Area has some unique things, and it's a different part of the world that everyone looks to go to. But what is your point of view, and what do you think about San Francisco and the Bay Area specifically, Silicon Valley?
All right, so defining Silicon Valley is hard. San Francisco has a vibe that is a little bit different than Santa Clara County. So I actually live in Palo Alto, Menlo Park, not in San Francisco straight, but the boundaries of Silicon Valley are expanding. So Oakland is now a part of it, and all the way to it's kind of the entire Bay Area, so to speak. I think you kind of have to go really far back in history. I mean, in my mind, I've grappled with this question. I think American culture in and of itself is about pioneering. It's about really going to a place where nobody's gone before, working your butt off, working really hard at making a life, right? So sometimes when we even just take a drive around, and I am in awe of this very difficult mountainous region and how a society has sprung up here. Like, what was it like 200 years ago when there were no roads, and how difficult was it to get up here, in this weather and this ecosystem in the middle of these forests and create this life. So I think that's a component of it, which I find interesting and compelling and unique. And it takes a very certain type of character to be able to survive and do well here. Second, in general, I think the history of San Francisco has always been to some degree rebellious. It's, different people coming from different parts of the world, again, working really hard at trying to make a life for themselves in any way that they could possible. And I think that has persisted. And it's not unique potentially to San Francisco, but probably most of the coastal cities in the US. So, from San Francisco to New York, East Coast, that's kind of an enduring culture. But in the Bay Area, it has a peculiar history because I think Stanford is probably relatively central to that story. Just being a beacon of knowledge and, lots of brilliant people coming here. But it seems that in the early days, Stanford would educate these brilliant people, but most of them would go back to the East Coast, which was where the hub of finance and business. And so people would learn here, but then go to the East Coast until I think it was a professor at Stanford that challenged some students to stay. Why leave to another part? And so they did. I think it was the Hewlett-Packard, couple, and that whole garage, making something out of your garage became kind of, took on its own mythical and epical kind of story. and just became an inspiring story. So, you know, kind of like the new gold rush, like California was known for the gold rush back in the day. And it's just stories that inspire people to come to that place, and, you know, potentially some of it will rub off, and they'll do well. And you know, the more brilliant people that come to a particular spot, the more chances and the likelihood that something good comes out of that spot. And I think that's just how it is. It was a story that inspired people. These people flocked, and people still flock here today. And so more innovation comes out of here today just by the sheer number of people who come, I think, as a result of that inspirational story. I don't think there's anything else that's special about this area that makes it such a good hotspot for great companies to come out of it and innovation to come out of it. And then over time, of course, money started to become centralized here. So because so much innovation is coming out of here, the money flocked here too. So it started to leave the East Coast and come here. And I think, you know, one of the myths I would say is that you need to come here to do well. I would say no, money will go where you are, right? Where something good is happening, money will come to you. You just need to do well where you are, understand, you know, where's a good place to do that, and an enabling environment always helps as well.
Great, great. And the learnings are also very important. And throughout, you know, moving from one challenge to the other, you're always learning. But there's always something in the back of your mind that tells you, I really wish I'd known that before. And what were the things that you sometimes think, oh, I really wished I had known that? And what are the things that you were really happy that someone helped out or someone gave you that advice before that? So these like are two different questions in one.
These are great questions. I think the only one that I could speak to wholeheartedly, because there's a lot, but you know, hindsight, I always tell, I'm a bit skeptical about hindsight. Hindsight is always, it's always easy to say, oh, had I known that, you know, I would have done things differently. I think the one thing though that I can say wholeheartedly is I wish someone had told me in my youth that it's okay to be you. That you don't have to have a different persona in different situations. You don't have to be different at work than you are at home or than you are in real life. And I think I learned that kind of a very long-winded hard way. And I have to say, it's one of the reasons why I love the job that I have today, because the company that I'm in and the culture just really allows you to do that, which might not be the case in other places. But just in retrospect, looking back, had I stuck true to who I am, I think a lot of the problems I had to deal with and my growing pains and my maturity and developing my maturity and going through navigating difficult relationships and difficult situations would have just been so much easier, because I wouldn't have had to switch my mindset or just be a different person, which doesn't sit well with you. So that would be, I think, my only advice, not so much of a business advice, but just makes your life easier. Someone who's helped me or given me a good piece of advice, there have been many, many people. And I think, again, one of the things that I wish I had done better is listen to that advice more wholeheartedly, or been more intent about absorbing that advice and taking it and thinking about it and actually applying it. A lot of the time you listen to the advice, especially in your youth, you listen to advice and you take it with a grain of salt and you still do what you think is right, or what, you know, you think, yeah, that works for this person, but you know, yeah, that's that person. Let me just go on doing what I want to do. And I think I would have hoped that I had absorbed that advice a little better. But the ones that stick closer to my head, I would say my grandfather was very influential to how, you know, I shaped my thought process. He told me to always be on time. In fact, he always told me to be 5 minutes early, because if you are not showing respect to the people that you're going to be dealing with, doesn't matter what it is, whether it's, you know, picking up your food at a restaurant or going to a doctor's or just going to a meeting, it's about respect, and respect comes in little steps. And the moment you break it, it's very, very hard to come back. So that was an incredible piece of advice that I took to heart, and I'm glad that I did. And then one of my bosses at work when I was at the travel industry, and he was one of the best bosses I ever had. I am a hard worker by nature. I will put my heart and soul into the work, and I will work very long hours. And I was always the last person to leave the office. They actually used to leave the office key with me because I was always the last person to leave the office. I managed a very large region, so I had 48 countries. So I, again, took it to heart. I didn't want to manage remotely, so I traveled a lot. And I tried to stay as close to the teams as I could. And then he called me into his office one day and he said, "I need to talk to you." And I thought, oh my God, what did I do? You know, I must have done something wrong. This is not good. He rarely ever wants to talk to me, so there must be a problem. And he sits me down and he's like, "Close the door." And I'm like, oh my God, this is really serious. I close the door. And he's like, "How long were you away in this last trip? You know, back to back." And I said, "About 3 weeks." And he's like, "You were away from your family for 3 weeks?" And I said, "Yeah." He's like, "Don't do that again." And I was like, "Why?" And he's like, "Because you need to be with your family. You're a person, you're a human. You can't do this. You can't spend that much time at work. And please try to leave before 9. And please try to," and he just sat me down and he's like, "This is not good. You know, you're doing a great job, but I don't want you to be that person. So please stop." And I have to say that up until that point, like working at Citi, I used to work 18 to 19 hours a day because my team sat in China and in Silicon Valley. So I had this massive time difference that I had to manage. And I just got used to it and it was required and people wanted more. And my boss literally looked me in the face and he's like, you know, "Give as much as you can, but you have to preserve yourself. You have to preserve like who you are. You have to be healthy. You have to sleep. You have to eat. You have to go read. You need to read. I need you to be a well-educated person. You need to spend some time reading and being with other people." So those are the two best bits of advice I got.
That's great. No, that's some good advice here, and I assume everyone. Let's see who's here. Who's joining from different? You guys in the chat, not in the Q&A. Can you just mention where you're joining from? If you're from a different city, from a different country, I'd like to hear from you. We'll get to the Q&A part after we listen from Noha. Dubai. Okay, we have someone from Dubai. Bosnia. Alexandria, Lebanon, Cairo. That's great. So we have a lot of people joining, and I assume this is on Zoom. We're streaming on UK also, Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, Tunisia. That's great. That's great. So I'm sorry, guys, who are watching on Facebook or YouTube, you can't interact here. But if you want to ask any questions and interact, you can just join in Zoom right now. So Noha was just telling us about the learnings and the advice she got on a personal level as an individual, at in a personal professional life. But Noah has been also involved with many teams and have launched a lot of products and services with several organizations throughout her journey. So Noah, I wanted to ask you, businesses, startups, the whole thing is based on teams. It's based on people, and this is what makes it or breaks it. So how do you really build a strong team and sustain those people together, bring them together in order to get the best out of those people? I know it's not a short answer, but what are your takes regarding teams?
You are as good as your team, right? You can't do good work if you don't have a good, coherent, well-working, well-functioning team. So you cannot underestimate the importance of building a strong, happy, well-functioning team. Like, to me, that is central and core to anything else that you do in a startup, anything else that you do even within a large company. And so I think this is a great question because I think it's a passion of mine as well. And I like to draw parallels from real life examples that we have around us. The strongest teams that you know of, probably you've experienced it even growing up, are either your sports team, maybe if you've been to the army, your platoon or your little coherent unit in the army. And, I spend a lot of time thinking about why is that? Why is it that, you're high school basketball team or your middle school volleyball team, or even that little team that you played with in the club, are the ones that you held dearest to your heart and you remember with such affection. And not only that, but you probably worked your butt off to do well. And spending a lot of time thinking about it, because I've had to build teams pretty much from the onset of my working career, I've come to the conclusion that it really is some basic building blocks. One, you have to get to know every single person on your team quite deeply. And by quite deeply, it's really two-pronged. It's on the personal level. You have to know them as people. You have to know their histories, what motivates them, what struggles they have, and just really build that empathy and that personal relationship with the team. So if you're stepping into an existing team, you're like inheriting a team, you're not actually building one from scratch, that is key. And probably also key as you start selecting and building a team that you get to choose. So get to know them as people. It will go a long way when you're in trouble, when you're having issues, how to unblock. Just knowing them as a person, knowing what motivates them and why they operate or why they think in a certain way will help you deal accordingly. So that's kind of my first observation. Second, get to know them, again, deeply in their work, in their working style, so that you can build a map in your head of their strengths and weaknesses, but not just build that map in your head, but also have a very clear discussion with them about your perception of their strengths and weaknesses. Because again, this is your perception. This might not be their perception. And both of you getting aligned on that perception is key in order for you to continue to function well. What that means in a nutshell is get very, very clear on what they can bring to the table, and agree on what they can bring to the table versus where they might need some help. And they need to also be aware and knowledgeable of where they might need some help to grow or to learn or to get better. So those are kind of two, get to know them really, really well. And ways of doing that vary. So, you know, on the personal level, just spend time, even off work. It's an investment. It's hard work getting to know your team, but it's a very valuable and one of the most important investments you can make. And then on work, as much as possible, try to embed yourself with a project that you either co-do, like work together on, or just try to get involved on some level closely with at least one project with that person. So that's kind of how to get to know your team. The second, I think, important thing in building a strong team is develop a shared victory and a shared loss, right? So again, why do sports teams do really well? They win together, they lose together, they have disappointments together, but they also have great moments together. So try to celebrate victories together really well, and also mourn, you know, difficulties and losses together really well. Establish that emotional connection on every turning point in the journey. Like take the time to stop and say, this has been hard. You know, take that moment and have that discussion about how this was hard. And also take that moment and say, this was bloody awesome. Like we did a great job. So those are two really, really important things to do. Again, to develop that shared history, that shared victory and shared kind of loss or not doing so well. And then lastly, I think it's being very clear, lastly, certainly but not least, being very clear about what it is we're out to do as a team. So whether it's a micro team or whether it's the entire company, having a very, very, very clear vision and always going back to that vision. You know, when we're in a discussion about how to move next and we don't agree, you know, we can either go route A or route B or route C, bring the discussion back to what are we here for? What are we here to do? Where is it that we're heading, right? Where is our North Star? What is our vision? Why are we doing this? So always be very, very clear about that vision. And then more importantly, take that vision, that kind of, vision that we're all agreeing on, and make it very clear to each individual where their role within that vision is. So kind of a job clarity is really important, and revisiting that job clarity almost on a monthly, even quarterly basis. Just go back to, how do you feel about the work that you're doing? Do you think it's working for you? What can we change to make it better? How does it continue to help us collectively reach that vision? So job clarity and goal clarity. So I would say just these three buckets, if you're constantly thinking about them and doing them, I would say it's almost impossible to develop a bad functioning team at that point.
That's great advice, Noha. Thanks a lot. And so you talked about victories and losses, and I think these are two things that you've probably been through several of them, and I hope more victories. I can see more victories, but in your previous role in PayPal, you can pick one. You can pick either one victory or one loss, one major accomplishment, or something that didn't really go well in PayPal.
PayPal was a bittersweet experience. Actually, it wasn't a long one. It was one of my shortest, I would say, stints, but very dear to my heart. I love that company. I love that brand. I've been an ardent user of PayPal since they started in the early 90s. I'm super excited to join that team. It's going through a lot of changes. So I joined at a very tumultuous time because they were kind of reorging and, laying off a lot of people. So it was a difficult time when I was there. And I would say it's hard to pinpoint particular victories and losses, but I think my biggest victory in PayPal, it always goes back to people, is developing really, really good, strong relationships in a time of extreme change and upheaval. So it was a very difficult time for everybody. My role when I first joined was to develop relationships. So I managed, when I first joined, the product marketing team for partnerships. So, PayPal processes payments. It has many different lines of business. One of their lines of business is processing payments for large entities. So Shopify, Magento, WooCommerce, Zalando, Facebook, they are kind of the rails for the payments for a lot of these large companies. And so I had to head up the PMM, the product marketing world for that. And most of my team, in fact, all of my team sat across the world. So they sat in Berlin and Singapore and Latin America, and very few sat in North America. And the team is widely dispersed. And the problem that I stepped in to solve for that team was they didn't feel that head office necessarily heard or prioritized what each locale needed. So, the Berlin team were responsible for EMEA, and the needs of EMEA. The Singapore office was responsible for kind of APAC needs, like here's what some of the Asian countries need. And, in a tech company where it's a large tech company where you have finite resources, you have a certain number of engineers, a certain number of like product managers. How do we roadmap? Like, how do we prioritize our roadmap and what to build and for who? Right. And so the primary goal for me being there is help us develop a global voice, and not just a kind of a Western world or advanced market voice, which again is a passion of mine. And so my success would be that I've built that really well. Like I did that down to the T. Like I established the relationships with leadership, with the people on the ground, with the eng, with the product managers to try and, steer that roadmap in a way that made sense for all these other markets. My failure, I would say, was not getting things to change quick enough, not getting, certain requirements shipped out the door as fast as I would have hoped in a typical environment. And I know I blame myself for that, and everybody says you shouldn't because the company was in flux. But the stark difference between how quickly I can ship things at Facebook versus PayPal just makes me constantly feel like that was a failure at PayPal. Like I would have hoped that we could ship things out the door quicker. It's a great question.
Yeah. So we had a lot of questions planned, but I think I'm going to ask you one last question, and then we can switch to the audience questions. So we're trying to stay very positive in what we're doing now, considering what's happening, what's happening with the COVID-19 and, the lockdown that most of us are in, but we can't ignore it. So we need to, open the floor and ask you, how do you foresee the change that is going to happen, not now, but post this COVID-19 pandemic?
it's hard to foresee change post an upheaval. Like I was in Egypt during the revolution. We all went through that together, and we all imagine things to go in various different ways depending on which end of the spectrum you sat, right? And it's hard because we're talking about societal shifts, and it's hard to understand where they would go. So I'm not going to sit here and predict, but I'm going to sit here and say, here's what I hope. Like, this is my hope and dream coming out of this. What could possibly change? One, as a parent, education, right? Like, I'm hoping that there's a seismic shift in how we educate, generations beyond. It's almost like a new industrial revolution where we need to think about what are we educating for, and therefore think, how are we educating? Our educational system hasn't changed since its inception during the time of industrial revolution. And, there's been a lot of talk in the past 20 years about the need for that to change. And, little tidbits have happened here and there, but realistically, not much has changed. And just watching my daughter, who's a middle schooler, do her Zoom sessions every day, and having to get super, super organized and really own her own schedule and own her own learning experience has just been inspirational. And something has to come out of this. Something has to change. And so I'm feeling very optimistic that the teachers and, the people who are involved in the educational ecosystem will take that experience and do something with it, and just cause a significant change in how we educate future generations. Education. Hopeful, optimistic. Let's hope it happens. Second thing I'm hoping for, and I'm feeling super optimistic about, and it could be naive optimism, but I'd rather be naive and optimistic than realistic, is how we deal with our economy. I think one thing COVID has shown is the stark differences between those who have and those who don't, and how vulnerable and susceptible those who don't are, and their inability to withstand, minor or from minor to major disruptions. And something about our societal system, I don't want to call out capitalistic systems per se, because not all the countries are capitalistic, but in general, I'm hoping something in our economic thought process, there's a seismic shift there. And we have been kind of oscillating between over-regulation, over-government regulation of economies versus deregulation, and it has to sit somewhere in between. We just need to, I think, agree as a society, certain areas that are red lines that just need to be regulated a little better by government. So that's another area that I'm optimistic about, that, more people will start thinking about it now. And then lastly, I think I'm hoping that we are a little bit more understanding of each other as human beings. Like, we've built bigger empathy towards each other, that we're all the same. In the past few years, I think there's been a rise in just racism and othering, kind of, it's us versus them, kind of that conversation needs to go away. I think technology has shown us that we're pretty much all the same, and that there's no society that's better than the other, and something as small as a virus can make even the best of us, just really, really sick. So hopefully, I'm just feeling optimistic that societies can start to, be a little bit more empathetic of each other. And just even within our own little micro communities, we can start to understand each other a little better. So that's my hope.
Those are great hopes. And, as much as we're all in this situation together, and it's not very easy, it's extremely hard, but it's hard on the whole world. And this is like the first time something that hits the whole planet. And I agree with you on every point you mentioned, and let's just hope for the best. So, not to take much of your time, I know that you must have a lot of things to finish on your day, but we'd like to take some questions. So we have our first question from Malden Knezovic, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. Considering that you are a woman, what were your biggest obstacles as a successful businesswoman? Best wishes.
Great question. They persist till today. I mean, even in Silicon Valley, there's an incredible deficit to being a woman, incredible deficit to being a Middle Eastern woman, or you don't have, a typical Western name. I think back in the 90s when I was at City and even when I was at Starwood, that conversation wasn't a part of work. Like today, at least that conversation is there. You know, people think about, you know, women in the workplace, people think about the obstacles that they face. Back then, it just didn't exist. And so, believe it or not, I didn't even think about it. I just had to, you know, adapt more male-like ways of doing things because it was inconceivable to not do that. It was inconceivable to think about it and think that, you know, I was being treated differently because I was a woman. I feel far more empowered today to speak up, and especially speak up for the women on my team and be like, hang on, why are you asking her to take the notes? You take the notes. Or, you know, why is she the one that has to organize the group event? You organize the group event. Like even just these little things. And then just being very conscious of diversifying the team as much as possible, because diversity really does bring a lot of good things. So I did not have good experiences for the longest part of, you know, my career, being a woman, sometimes even the only woman on an executive team. So being the only woman on the table, I was not heard. I would say something and people would say it, and then it was like, wait, I just said that. And I didn't feel empowered to step up and say, I just said that. I actually remember at Starwood, we had this team building exercise and we brought in this external trainer, and she she opened a box, she gave us lots of instruments. And before she gave us the instruments, she asked who in this room, and it was all male hotel general managers. It was the only female leader in that room. And male hotel general managers tend to be beyond a certain age. So they're, you know, and they're used to being responsible for their world. And she said, before we start, who in this room has played an instrument before? So I raised my hand. I'm the only person who raised her hand. She's like, okay, thank you for that. You're all required to come up with a piece of music, just, you know, some instrumental piece of music, and I'm going to video it and I'm going to play it back to you guys. And she sat back and observed, right? So I tried to group people into, okay, you picked the percussion instruments, you picked, you know, the wood instruments, you picked, you know, so let's do this. And nobody would listen, right? These were GMs and they're used to, no, we're going to do our own thing. And they just wouldn't listen. And I tried and they wouldn't listen. And so, you know, she's like, time's up, play our instruments. We played our instruments. She videoed it and we sounded horrendous. Of course, it was horrible. Like nobody was playing anything that made sense with anyone else. And she played it back and she's like, I just want you all to note that the only person in this room who knows how to play music is her, and none of you would listen to her. Like the point of the team building exercise is try to listen to the person that knows best, even if they're not the manager, right? As a team, that's kind of how we function best together as a team. She wasn't even talking about it as a woman, but that was the moment it hit me, right? I was the only woman in the room. And then she's like, okay, let's try it again, but this time listen to her. I am designating her as your leader. So now you need to listen to her. And of course, it was actually a really good piece of music because, you know, I clearly denoted roles and told people what to do. You play on this beat, you play on this beat. And they were all just like, whoa. And they just treated me differently thereafter. It was just like, oh, we realized that we, you know, so anyway, I can talk about this for hours.
What was the instrument that you played?
Oh, I played the violin for some time as a child, and then I also played the flute. So a couple of instruments.
Interesting. So if you still have the video, if you can share it with us, we'll be.
I don't. Unfortunately, we never got a copy of it, but I would love to. Like, I would have loved to keep it. Yeah.
You can send us a new one. We'll put it on Facebook. Okay, so we have another question from Haitham, and he's asking, as you said, the life business balance is so important, but I was suffering of not being able to do this balance as my company assigned me a lot of tasks because I'm a business unit manager responsible for sales, marketing teams, and my company asked me to fill any gaps due to vacancies. So I did how it works every day and have no time for any life balance. And if I refuse, I'm afraid to be fired. I have no other option. What can I do?
You know, I love this. I worked in City for close to 6.5 years. I was launching banking services for 6 years straight. I didn't take a single day off. They owed me hundreds of thousands in paid leave by the time I left. I almost worked through all my weekends, 18 hours a day. I used to work from 5 o'clock in the morning till about midnight or 1 a.m. every day. I got 4 hours of sleep. I had a pretty abusive boss. He was abusive. And the working system was abusive. I remember being in meetings where our CEO would sit us down, or, the person, the big boss who was in charge would sit us down. We had mid-monthly reviews, and they would go on for hours and hours. And I remember once in my last few years, I would, it's Ramadan and I need to go home for iftar. And my dad lived in another country, so he would visit us from time to time, maybe a couple of times a year, and he happened to be there, and it was Ramadan, and I hadn't seen my dad in months. And I remember telling him, look, I gotta go, my dad's in town, I need to go have this meal with him. And I got up and he pulled my arm and he sat me down. So he was not just abusive, but he was also physically abusive. Like, he sat me down and he said, you can't go, we have to finish this. I'm like, I'm sorry, I need to go. And he's like, no. And my dad was texting me, he's like, where are you? And I just, at that moment, just took that decision. I was like, I'm sorry, I have to go. And I left. And it, my relationship with that manager never repaired. Like, it never got better. But I think it was the first time in my life that I knew that when we say in our heads, I don't have an option, it's a story you tell yourself in your head. You always have an option, and I feel, yes, we fear for our roles and we fear for our jobs and we need income and we need livelihoods, but don't ever put yourself in a position where you are being abused that way. Like, this was a very hard lesson for me to learn. I did eventually leave, and I didn't leave well. But I learned a lot from that experience. Like, I need to own, my work style, and I need to own my decisions on how to work and set your own boundaries, like how to set your own boundaries. It's a really hard thing to learn. But I would encourage you to speak to as many people as possible, seek advice, find a mentor, find someone else within your company who's not your manager, and seek advice on how to navigate that relationship. And just sit with your manager and have a very difficult conversation about, look, I need to be able to also have a life. So what can we do and how can we fix this? I mean, that's kind of the best advice I can give you. You always have an option. You always have a choice.
Great. And we have another question from Tarek. He's asking, given your expertise in the fintech space, how do you build out an ecosystem to help foster innovation in a country with a lot of regulations and poor digital and mobile banking?
It's a great question. Let me just say on the onset that fintech, the world of finance is heavily regulated everywhere. So this is not unique to, Egypt or any North Africa or, a developing economy. Like, it's heavily regulated. It's probably one of the most regulated industries aside from healthcare. Like, that's just a fact of that particular industry. And for good reason. When you think about just governments and how they govern money and monopoly on kind of the economy and the money flow, and monopoly on power is what creates a government, right? If you don't have that monopoly on power and the monopoly on money, you don't govern. Like, if you don't control it, you don't govern. And so there's a reason why it's heavily regulated. I think navigating that world, and again, I'm going to think back to my city days, because we had to launch financial services in an environment in a very different way than what existed at the time. So some key steps that I would say always useful in the fintech world. Know your regulatory environment like you know your kids. Like, read every law book that exists out there, even if you're not a lawyer. Just know it really well. Just know where your back is, like where you're going to hit a wall. Know where your walls are, right? Don't be afraid to get creative about how to navigate those regulatory environments, but don't get too creative. Baby steps, right? Because if you push too far, you're going to get slapped. Like, even big companies get slapped. So know how to get creative, but do it in little steps. I'm going to give you a small example. When we started car loans in Citi, I think we were the first bank to do unsecured. We were the first bank to do unsecured lending in Egypt. And that was really, really hard. It was even really hard to understand sort of the credit risk environment because it hadn't been done before. And then when we decided we're going to start car loans, I think I spent 3 months of my life reading every law book there existed out there. And the reason why I'm telling you read the rules and regulations, because your lawyers, even though this is their world and lawyers are going to hate me for this, they do miss things. Because you're not knowledgeable, you don't take things for granted. So when you read them very intently and you ask a lot of questions, which is always good. So our lawyers, told us, you can't do this. You can't do car loans the way you want to do them, which is what we wanted to do is, not have a secured a loan for a car and just be able to repossess the car if somebody defaults. The laws in Egypt said we couldn't do this beyond a certain amount of payments that happened. This law was written in, 1954, right? So, it was written at a time where a socialistic mentality was kind of the reigning mentality. Now, we had one of two approaches. Do we want to lobby and try to push and change that law? That's a long and difficult road to take. Or do we try to get creative about how can we operate within that law? So we decided to take the route of how to get creative. So we sat and reread the law. I think we changed our lawyers about 4 times during that time because we wanted a lawyer that had a can-do attitude, that wanted to think creatively, that didn't just say, don't do it. And we came up with some interesting solutions, which I won't get into because it's kind of, again, a whole discussion in its point. But the point that I'm trying to make is heavily regulated. Yes, it needs to be. Sometimes with fintech and innovation in general, especially with technology, you are way ahead of legislative. It's not just in fintech, it's in most technology aspects. You are way ahead of where the legislators are. And it takes a very long time for legislators to grapple with, how to legislate for this. So in the meanwhile, just understand your boundaries, baby steps, get creative in a way that doesn't get you slapped on the hand. That's kind of the best advice I can give you.
Great. So, and we have a question from Saif. He wants to hear more about your experience in dealing with international teams with really diverse cultural differences and how to manage conflicts while maintaining what this cultural diversity brings to the team.
I cannot underscore the importance of diversity to a team. I think I used to hear this stuff when I was younger and be like, yeah, whatever. But the more I got involved with diverse teams, having different perspectives and different points of view, just by the nature of it, makes you more innovative. Not being stuck in a sound chamber really helps you go out there and do things very differently and in a way that is far more enriching and probably far more successful than you would without having a diverse team. So be very mindful about connecting with as diverse set of views as possible. So even if you're in a company that isn't as diverse, try to step out of that boundary, try to go and meet people in either different parts of the world or listen to points of views from different people that you wouldn't have typically listened to, and absorb that and see how that impacts the work that you're doing. So I'd say be conscious about it and do it as much as you can. How do you then manage teams that span geographies? Again, you have to keep it at the forefront and be very mindful of connecting. I think COVID might have made this easier for people to imagine today and understand the struggle. Like now that I don't get to see my team as much, we have sessions where we just check in on each other and say hi. It's not about work. It's about how are you doing? How are you doing? How are you managing the kids at home and work? How are you managing being alone? And, some people are single and they haven't seen a human being in weeks. And just saying like, how are you doing? But then a part of it is also the communication boundary. So, language can be a barrier. So how do we overcome that? How do we, if we have a conversation, then go back and email a summary of that conversation just to be extra sure that in that conversation, I heard you correctly, I understood your weird accent correctly, and that we're both kind of aligned, right? When it's documented, that makes things easier. Going back and checking, did I get you? Did I understand the situation correctly? Managing conflict is something that's dear to my heart. Actually, my first stint with Facebook was not my current role. I actually used to train at Facebook a few years ago. I trained a course called Crucial Conversations. And I essentially trained Facebookers on how to have very, very difficult conversations that they just didn't want to have with people that they were having trouble with at work. So, somebody that's giving you a hard time at work, and how do you go and talk to them and explain that to them? The gist of the course, it's about a 6 to 8 hour class. I'm going to summarize it to you in 2 minutes. 3 key steps. Always assume good intent, right? So assume that this person is not necessarily coming from a bad place. Recognize that there's a story in your head that might not be entirely true. So you might read what they're doing and explain it to yourself in a way that's not grounded in facts or not grounded in reality. It's just how we are as humans. It's just the way that we're built. We're built to interpret things from our point of view. And so going down and kind of going back to the facts, what happened, not the how, not how you're experiencing it. What did they say? What did they do? Like just the facts, right? And then taking these facts to that person. So tell the person, here's what happened. And then explaining to them how it made you feel. This is how it made me feel. It made me feel like I was disrespected. It made me feel like, I wasn't important. It made me feel like whatever, however it made you feel. Made me feel angry, made me feel sad. They can't argue with how you feel. They can't argue with your interpretation of their intent. So you did this because you don't like me. You did this because you want to get better than me at work, or you did this because they can't argue with that. So the purpose of the conversation is to open the door to reinterpret why this relationship isn't working, and you want it to be a back and forth conversation. And so if you put them in a defensive position, or if you're interpreting their world for them, then it's going to end up being an argument. It's going to descend into, they're either going to shut up and just not want to engage, or they're going to get defensive and it's going to spiral out of control. So you have to state the facts, acknowledge your emotions, and then close it with, not really close it, kind of open it with saying, can you please explain to me your point of view? Can you please explain to me what actually happened? Can you please explain to me how you see this? And that way you open the door for a dialogue. And once you open the door for dialogue, you're immediately establishing trust. Now, it might be difficult to do face-to-face, so you might want to do it while you're walking, or, over the phone. Like if you're not comfortable meeting eye to eye, find a situation where you find it comfortable. But that's kind of it in a nutshell. That's how you deal with difficult situations. Just deal with them head on.
Yeah, that's the crash course on trust building.
Yeah.
We promised you 45 minutes and we almost took an hour. I appreciate that you are with us. We have a lot of questions, but unfortunately we won't be able to take them all. I hope we've answered most of the questions. Stay safe, you and your family and all your loved ones, and we hope that you are able to join us in Alexandria end of September for our Techne Summit. Hopefully things are turn out to be well by that date. Have a great day and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.